Inside the turret of the M4A2 tank, Condor, Private Joe D. Woolham gripped the electric traverse handle as the 32-ton vehicle lurched through chest-deep water toward a shoreline shrouded in smoke and the relentless hammer of machine gun fire. He was trying to find targets, swinging the turret around even before the tank touched dry sand, when a massive concussion, either a shell hitting the aft of the landing craft or the tank itself, slammed through the steel hull. Sparks showered from the electrical system. The turret began spinning wildly on its own, and Woolham suddenly found himself locked inside a runaway killing machine on a reef that had already become a graveyard. Up through the open hatch, the world was a landscape of violent noise. The crump of Japanese 75mm Type 88 anti-aircraft guns firing across the runway, the crack of bullets pinging off armor plate, and the shouts of tank commanders screaming orders their crews could barely hear. This was Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll, on the morning of 20 November 1943, the first large-scale frontal assault from the sea against a heavily fortified beach, and the men of Charlie Company, 1st Corps Medium Tank Battalion, were riding into it with untested doctrine, unreliable radios, and a handful of diesel tanks they had never once fired in combat. In the minutes that followed, Woolham's tank would be disabled, his crew scattered or killed, and his own finger shot off before he even reached the seawall. But how did a green, poorly equipped medium tank company find itself wading into one of the most brutally contested beaches in Marine Corps history? To understand the chaos on that reef, we need to step back 10 months, to a dusty patch of California rangeland, where a battalion of raw recruits was trying to learn how to fight a war no one had yet fought. On 18 January 1943, the 1st Corps Medium Tank Battalion was officially activated at Jacques Farm, a primitive training area tucked into the sprawling ranchlands of what is now Camp Pendleton, north of San Diego. The site was ideal for tank training, vast expanses of grassland where vehicles could maneuver without restriction. But the battalion itself was anything but ideal. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Bennett G. Powers, it had been cobbled together from a mix of officers pulled from other units and enlisted men straight out of boot camp, with the inevitable result that discipline was loose, training was fragmented, and the entire organization operated more like a collection of independent fiefdoms than a coherent fighting force. Charlie Company, the unit that would eventually bear the brunt of the fighting on Tarawa, was no different. Its first commanding officer was a second lieutenant named Richard O. Sloat, a high school speech and drama teacher from Puyallup, Washington, whose bright red hair earned him the nickname the Red Dog Fox among the men. Sloat was by all accounts the kind of officer enlisted Marines respected instinctively, a man who fell the company out and marched up and down the ranks after a wallet was stolen, declaring that anyone caught stealing would have his body left in front of the first sergeant's desk. The thief vanished overnight, and Sloat's reputation was sealed. The men Sloat led came from wildly disparate backgrounds, united only by the accident of war and the swift expansion of the Corps. Ed Gazelle, a 21-year-old from Michigan, had been about to get drafted when he and his wife's cousin decided to join the Marines. After boot camp, he was simply assigned to the new medium tank battalion because they needed bodies. Charles D. Mason was an Oregon farm boy who had spent 10 months welding for a shipbuilding company before enlisting, drawn to the tanks because he liked them after washing out of aviation gunnery school. Joe D. Woolham, an Oklahoma City high school dropout, had joined the Marines because older boys from his neighborhood had gone to Guadalcanal and written home about it, and within 5 minutes of hitting boot camp, he was convinced he had made a catastrophic mistake. The company slept in squad tents, never in barracks, because the tanks would tear up the roads if they moved into the main camp areas. When they first pitched their tents in a dry wash, it promptly rained for 2 weeks, turning the wash into a raging river that cut them off from supplies. Men learned to live coated in dust when the weather turned hot, then mired in mud when the rains returned, a cycle of misery punctuated by the hazards of the California hills. Like the afternoon Scott Kinsman, a Scottish immigrant from Illinois, was backing up to guide his tank into position and nearly stepped backward onto a diamondback rattlesnake, coiled 4 feet away, ready to strike. The tanks themselves were a constant source of frustration. The first vehicles issued to Charlie Company were M4A4s, powered by massive Chrysler multi-bank gasoline engines, 5 separate engines driving a single shaft, with 5 carburetors, 5 water pumps, and an ignition system that required near-impossible synchronization. Charles Mason recalled them as a miserable thing, powerful when they were properly tuned, but almost useless when they were not. The Marine Corps had acquired only 22 of the M4A4s before phasing them out entirely, switching to the diesel-powered General Motors M4A2, the tank that would carry Charlie Company into battle at Tarawa. Let us pause here and examine this machine, the M4A2 medium tank, which would become the primary weapon system of these young Marines. Designated as a mid-production vehicle, it weighed nearly 32 tons and was propelled by twin GM 671 diesel engines originally designed as marine boat motors, coupled through a transfer case to a single transmission. The hull armor was 2 inches thick at the sponsons and slightly less on the slope plate, angled at 56 degrees from the vertical to deflect incoming rounds, though, as the men would soon learn, the Japanese 75mm Type 88 gun could punch through it at point-blank range. On the turret sides, each crew had painted a name beginning with the letter C, Sea Ilia, Commando, China Gal, Condor, Colorado, and above each name rode the battalion's distinctive emblem, an elephant with one front foot upraised, firing a cannonball from its trunk with a puff of smoke, a red blanket draped across its back. Under the factory paint, barely visible through a thin overcoat, some vehicles still carried the White Star and War Production Board serial numbers from their original Army depot stocks, a silent reminder that these tanks had been allocated to the Marines almost as an afterthought. The tanks were new when they arrived in June 1943, replacing the worn-out training vehicles that had been so heavily used they were stripped and left derelict when the battalion shipped out. Warrant Officer Roger Massey, a former motor transport sergeant who would later prove to be a genius at keeping damaged tanks running under fire, was responsible for the maintenance that kept the new machines operational. But even with brand new equipment, the company's training was limited by the realities of its situation. The radios were obsolete Navy GF sets, notoriously unreliable and incapable of communicating with infantry TBX and TBY tactical nets, and the crews had never fired their guns since leaving Pendleton 166 days without a single live-fire exercise by the time they sailed for combat. In May 1943, a new officer arrived to take command of Charlie Company, a first lieutenant named Edward L. Bale, who had enlisted in the Marine Corps in June 1939 and earned his commission through the Platoon Leaders Class program. Bale was the senior first lieutenant in the battalion, but also its most junior company commander, a Texan who had attended an Army tank maintenance course at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and then commanded a light tank platoon in a racially segregated defense battalion before requesting a transfer to the West Coast. When Bale reported in, the area command chief of staff offered to send him to the tank battalion, but warned him he would probably be leaving the States in 60 days. Bale said simply, "Send me." The battalion Bale found horrified him. Every company did its own thing, developing its own training schedules and operating with almost no centralized oversight. The battalion commander had no hands-on experience with tanks, and critical parts, tools, and even field glasses were perennially in short supply. But instead of complaining, Bale simply took charge of his own unit. Every Monday morning he led Charlie Company to the field, stayed out 4 nights doing live fire exercises and night operations, and brought the men back Friday afternoon for maintenance before Liberty Call. Looking back decades later as a retired colonel, Bale would describe it as the best pure tank training he ever experienced. The men were young, many still teenagers, with less than 6 months in the Corps, and their inexperience showed in dangerous ways. One evening, Joe Woolham, who had been assigned to the driving rotation, took some whiskey before getting behind the controls of a medium tank, something no one was supposed to do. As he approached a steep downhill slope near the camp, he failed to downshift in time, put the transmission into neutral, and sent the 32-ton vehicle careening off the edge, briefly airborne before slamming into the ground with a crash that jarred every man inside. No one was seriously hurt, but the lesson was plain. These men were still learning, and the learning curve was punishingly steep. On 19 July 1943, Charlie Company sailed out of San Diego aboard the SS John McClane, a Liberty ship designed for heavy cargo with limited troop accommodation. The voyage was 28 days at a top speed of 6 knots, a slow, grinding transit across the vast emptiness of the Pacific. On 30 July, the ship crossed the equator, and the Marines underwent the ancient naval ceremony of initiation into King Neptune's realm, a gauntlet of paddles, high-pressure hoses, body paint, and dead fish that spared no one, from the lowest private up to Lieutenant Bale himself. Each man who survived it became a shellback, his bedraggled typewritten certificate, a prized souvenir of the crossing. They arrived in New Caledonia on 13 August and were herded into a transit camp called Camp Magenta, about 15 miles by a bad road from the docks where their tanks sat idle. The camp was nothing but red mud. The training consisted of hikes and maintenance, because the French would not allow tanks on the roads for fear of damaging bridges and coconut trees, and the men quickly came to loathe the place. Ed Gazel would later call New Caledonia the arsehole of the universe. The only notable event in 3 months of waiting was the Nickel dock fire on 1 November, when ammunition being unloaded at the docks in Noumea caught fire and detonated in a massive explosion. Bale took his 2 headquarters tanks down to the docks to provide shielding if needed. But by the time he arrived, the crisis had passed, and he turned back without ever entering the fray. In late September, Bale was suddenly summoned to battalion headquarters and told his company would be attached to the 2nd Marine Division for an upcoming operation. He later learned that the battalion executive officer, Major Jeb Stewart, had rigged the drawing of straws to ensure Charlie Company got the assignment, because Bale had the best-trained company. The unit loaded aboard the SS Mormac on 27 September, made a brief stop in Wellington, New Zealand, and then returned to New Caledonia to await the specialized ship that would carry their tanks into the assault. That ship was the USS Ashland, designated LSD-1, the very first landing ship dock ever built, a revolutionary design that flooded its internal well deck to float preloaded LCM landing craft directly out into the ocean. The Ashland had sailed from San Diego in August, shuttled back to Hawaii, and delivered cargo to New Caledonia, but she had not had time to reach New Zealand. Instead, she met Charlie Company at Noumea, and on 4 November 134 men, 5 officers, 2 Navy medical corpsmen, and 12 medium tanks were embarked aboard her. Due to lack of space, the company's M32B2 tank recovery vehicle had to be left behind, a seemingly minor logistical compromise that would later cause immense difficulty on the beaches of Betio. The Ashland sailed for Ifate, in the French New Hebrides, for a hasty division rehearsal on 7 and 9 November, the first and only time Charlie Company would practice an amphibious landing before Tarawa. The rehearsals were little more than chaotic demonstrations. The tanks splashed ashore, sat on the beach, and never moved inland because thick jungle blocked any further advance. There was no joint training with infantry, no coordination with the rifle battalions they were supposed to support in combat, and no realistic test of the communication systems that would need to function under fire. Lieutenant Bale later described the rehearsals as almost useless, adding that the Marine Corps was naive about how to employ tanks in an amphibious assault. The problems ran deeper than anyone fully grasped at the time. The radios in the tanks were obsolete Navy GFRU sets, tuned radio frequency amplitude modulated systems designed in 1934, plagued by poor sensitivity, vulnerable to interference, and equipped with delicate vacuum tubes never intended for the brutal jostling, heat, and humidity of a tank interior. The loader, already the busiest man in the vehicle, was supposed to double as radio operator, cranking a hand-operated tuning dial to switch between company and platoon frequencies, while simultaneously manhandling 75mm shells into the breech and discarding hot, spent casings through the pistol port. No provisions were made for resupply of fuel or ammunition. No communications plan included the tank company in the overall tactical net, and Lieutenant Bale had met the regimental and battalion commanders exactly once, at a briefing where the atmosphere was tense because the original regimental commander had just been relieved and replaced by Colonel David Shoup, the division operations officer. On 13 November 1943, the USS Ashland sailed from Ifate, and the enlisted men of Charlie Company finally learned their objective, a tiny coral atoll in the Gilbert Islands called Tarawa, and within it, a fortified island named Betio, code-named Helen. The ship's well deck flooded, the LCMs floated free, and the men spent the night before D-Day doing whatever nervous troops do to kill time, checking equipment, eating steak and eggs, writing letters home, and, in the case of Lieutenant William I. Sheedy, the first platoon leader, playing poker and winning a substantial sum of money he would never collect. In the darkness before dawn on 20 November, the tanks sat waiting in their landing craft as the first salvos of the naval bombardment lit the horizon. Michael Shivets, the sergeant serving as loader in Bale's command tank Cecilia, later recalled that he and his crewmates had been told the island would be sunk by naval gunfire, that they would not have to worry about being killed or even hit. It was a terrible miscalculation. and they were about to discover just how wrong they were. The LCM's diesel engines hammered at a steady rhythm, pressing the flat-bottomed boat through the dark swells off Betio. Aboard the USS Ashland, the well deck had flooded hours earlier, and the ungainly landing craft had reversed out into a rough sea, their coxswains fighting the chop to form an assembly circle. Now the first grey light of November 20th revealed the low silhouette of the island, a coconut log seawall, columns of smoke from the naval bombardment, and the intermittent flash of Japanese shore batteries still firing. The schedule, already frayed by premature shelling and stronger than expected currents, was slipping further into disarray. Ashore, the defenders had used the lull between the bombardment's end and the carrier plane's late arrival to reposition weapons toward the lagoon. Inside the turret of the command tank, Cecilia, First Lieutenant Edward L. Bale crouched behind the gun breech, his throat microphone chafing against sweat-salted skin. The tank had been waterproofed with thick shaft grease smeared around every lower hull opening. But Bale knew the real danger was not the GM diesel engines drowning. Those could fire on compression even with damaged ignition. But the main electrical junction box low in the turret basket. If salt water reached that slip ring, everything electrical would go dead. Turret traverse, gun firing circuit, radios. The radios, those obsolete GF Roussettes, were already a source of deep unease. They could not communicate with the infantry nets, and there was no communications plan that included the tank company at all. Bale had a boat hook marked in 4-inch increments, and his orders were explicit. If the water exceeded 40 inches, the tanks would not disembark. At the reef's edge, a parallel disaster was unfolding in wooden-hulled LCVPs. 21 recon guides from Charlie Company, men trained to walk ahead of the tanks and mark obstacles, were crammed into a single Higgins boat approaching Red One. Among them was Private Edwin H. Vansell, a disciplinary problem back at Pendleton, who had been busted from corporal to private, and who now clutched a spherical float the size of a soccer ball. The plan was for the guides to wade ashore, drop the weighted floats to mark a safe lane through the craters, and then work eastward to mark paths for the other platoons. Sergeant K.A. Zerker was in charge. Before the boat even grounded, machine gun rounds began tearing through the plywood bulkheads. Zerker went down, hit in the boat, and 5 or 6 others fell, killed or wounded where they crouched. The survivors grabbed the extra floats and dove over the side into chest-deep water, where at least they would be smaller targets. Private First Class Melvin Swango, a young radio operator who had volunteered for reconnaissance duty, hit the water and immediately saw the plan disintegrate. The floats, tangled in the surge, drifted away. Japanese machine guns stitched the lagoon surface like a rainstorm, and men simply sank beneath the water without a sound. Swango, Vansell, and the others did the only thing left to them. They spread into a ragged line and became human markers, each man standing beside a submerged crater and waving the tanks around it with desperate arm signals. Wherever a man fell, another took his place. Private Vansell, the man who had been twice reduced in rank, stood in the open water and used himself as a channel marker, his silhouette a bullseye for every Japanese gunner on that side of the island. He would later be killed on the island, his body found beside Lieutenant Sheedy, his Silver Star awarded posthumously. Private James W. Toby did the same, and later, when the tanks had passed, he would crawl forward 150 yards inside enemy lines to guide a crippled tank back to safety. Toby survived the battle and was evacuated with the wounded, his war over. Swango, of the original 21 guides, knew of only 3 who survived the reef. He called it a suicide mission, and he never understood how any of them lived. The tanks, blind and deaf inside their steel boxes, followed the waving arms of the guides and lurched around the invisible craters, their exhausts churning the coral milky water as they ground toward the beach under a continuous hail of fire. Bale's LCM struck the reef at a point where the water measured 36 inches, and the ramp dropped. Sicilia lumbered forward into the lagoon, water sloshing over the bow slope plate, and the crew inside felt the peculiar sensation of the tracks gripping coral, a grinding, shuddering progress that could at any moment pitch into a deep hole. On Red 3, the 3rd platoon tanks were having their own ordeal. Sergeant John R. Mahon, commanding Colorado, felt the LCM scrape and jolt as it grounded, then watched the ramp go down, and his driver, Corporal Harold McNaughton, gun the diesel forward into opaque water. They got lucky and did not wash out. In Condor, just to Colorado's right, Private Joe D. Woolham had been riding atop the turret until a near-miss shell sent him scrambling inside. Now he hunched at the gunner's station, trying to rotate the turret electrically to find targets amid the smoke, when a heavy impact jarred the tank. The electric traverse jammed on, spinning the turret uncontrollably until Woolham cut the power and switched to the manual crank. By about 1000, Sicilia and the headquarters section's second tank, Commando, had crawled up onto the narrow strip of dry sand at the junction of Red 1 and Green beaches. Bale dismounted, scrambling along the hull under fire to search for a gap in the 4-foot coconut log seawall. He found none. The engineers who were supposed to blast breaches had been decimated on the reef. There was no way forward except to re-enter the water and move parallel to the beach, searching for a ramp. Bale ordered the other tanks to follow, and the two headquarters machines edged back into the lagoon, crawling westward past the bodies of dead Marines that lay along the waterline. About 50 yards from the intersection of Red 1 and Green Beach, they located a low spot, an opening the Japanese had used to move trucks onto the reef at low tide, and the tanks ground up and over the logs, finally on solid land behind the seawall. The scene inland was a Boschian nightmare of shattered palm trunks, burning fuel dumps, and drifting smoke that reduced visibility to yards. As Sicilia advanced, a Japanese Type 95 light tank suddenly lifted its turret over a sand and log revetment, its 37mm cannon pointing directly at the American machine. Sicilia's gunner, Private First Class Charles Martin, fired first and missed. The Japanese tank fired back. The 37mm round struck the muzzle of Sicilia's 75mm gun, a freak hit that shattered into fragments and sprayed down the barrel. The breach was open. Sergeant Michael E. Shivets, the loader, was crouched beside it with a fresh round in his hands when the flash and fragments erupted into the turret. A burst of colored light, 7 or 8 different colors, Bale remembered, and the impact knocked Shivets backward. He was peppered with tiny shrapnel wounds, but, miraculously, the 75 he was holding had not yet been rammed into the breach. Flashback, my a double SS, Shivets hollered at Bale. Something hit me, Commando. Just behind, fired into the Japanese tank and ripped its turret free. The brief duel was over, but Sicilia's gun was ruined, a large chunk of the muzzle missing, the rifling inside gouged and unusable. Bale ordered the tank back to the beach to assess the damage. Leaving Commando to continue supporting Major Mike Ryan's infantry, Sicilia reversed through the rubble, guided in part by Private Toby, who had crawled forward to help. At the beach, Bale looked down the tube and made a hard choice. The cannon could not be fired, but the machine guns worked, and the tank could carry ammunition and water. Commando forged ahead alone, working with Ryan's scattered units to push toward the southern shore. It destroyed 2 5-inch anti-boat guns and 5 pillboxes before taking at least 18 hits from 37mm guns positioned near the big coastal defense batteries. The crew survived, but the tank was finished, a derelict hulk sitting near the south end of Green Beach, its turret slewed to starboard. On Red 3, the 3rd platoon had crossed the seawall in better order and now spread into a loose line abreast formation moving inland. Second Lieutenant Louis R. Largy, the former sergeant from the USS Texas, commanded Cannonball, with his platoon sergeant's tank Charlie following close behind. Mans Colorado was on the right flank. The crews pushed across the taxi strip and into the open central triangle of the airfield, and there, at about noon, they emerged into a killing field. 4, possibly 6, Japanese Type 88, 75mm anti-aircraft guns, positioned on the far side of the main runway, opened fire at point-blank range. These were the most lethal anti-tank weapons in the Japanese arsenal, capable of penetrating M4A2 armor at 360 yards. The guns were mounted on tall pedestals, with cruciform legs that allowed full 360-degree traverse, and they had been emplaced in open pits facing the sea. Now their crews simply swung the muzzles inland and fired. The first tank struck was Cannonball. Hit several times, the driver veered right, trying to find cover behind a sand berm that turned out to be a revetment around a Japanese aviation fuel dump. The berm collapsed under the tank's weight, the vehicle tipped over onto its right side, and fuel drums ruptured, drenching the hull in gasoline. Largy and his crew scrambled from the hatches as the fuel ignited. Carly, following close, swung in front of the stricken tank to shield the escaping crew, and the Japanese guns shifted their fire. Rounds punched through Carly's sponson armor just below the turret ring, and an internal explosion, ammunition propellant, or the fuel fumes wrecked the machine. The crew escaped, but Carly was destroyed. In Condor, Woolham felt the concussive bang of hits, felt the tank shudder, and then heard the driver, Corporal Raymond Barker, shout that the fire warning light was on. The light was false. The impact had triggered a sensor malfunction. But inside a closed turret, with the smell of propellant and the memory of cannonball burning nearby, the crew believed they were on fire. Tank Commander Sergeant Robert F. Shook yelled, "Let's go," and bailed out. Woolham went right behind him. Radio operator Corporal Herschel B. Fulmer, a big man, was slower, and a shell fragment knocked him back into the turret. Driver Barker was shot and killed as he tried to exit. Assistant driver Private Harry O'Gray was also lost. Woolham and Shook tumbled onto the ground 100 feet from the burning fuel dump and ran. Shook was shot through the shoulder, and Woolham lost track of him. Woolham dove into a shallow shell scrape, where he realized the end of his right forefinger had been shot off. He lay there, the bone exposed, while the corpses of Marines floated in the rising tide. Looking up, he saw Colorado, the only 3rd platoon tank still moving, barreling toward the beach. Woolham leaped up, grabbed a lifting ring on the slope plate, and clung to the lurching hull as another shell struck the rear, the concussion knocking him off. He ran the last 75 yards on foot, pounded over the seawall, and collapsed among the wounded on Red 3. Mans Colorado on the far left had taken several gouges in the turret armor, but was still functional. He fired at the Japanese gun flashes until the tank's 75mm ammunition ran low, then retreated to the beach. The water off Red 3 was packed with dead and wounded Marines, and Marne drove into the shallows not, as myth would later claim, to extinguish a fire, but simply because there was no room to park on the sand. Major Henry P. Crow ordered him back over the seawall, and Colorado spent the late afternoon shuttling along the shore, firing inland at enemy positions from the water. By dusk, it was the only operational medium tank on Red 3. On Red 2, the 2nd platoon had also taken losses. Conger fell into an unseen shell hole, and Clipper lost one engine to a magnetic mine placed by a suicide attacker. Though the driver, Corporal Antonio Almaraz, disengaged the dead power plant and limped into a revetment. Only Cobra, commanded by a lieutenant who had taken over the platoon, remained fully mobile, and it spent the afternoon shelling positions from the taxi strip. At nightfall, Cobra's driver, Corporal Hester S. Webb, climbed out for a moment and was shot through the neck by a sniper. He died during the night, his platoon leader giving him morphine until the end. By the close of the first day, only Colorado, Cobra, and the repaired China Gal, which had rejoined Bale on Red 1 after its gun breach was cleared, remained operational. The radios had failed entirely. Marne never used his, and Bale coordinated with Major Ryan by climbing out of his tank and running across the sand, or by infantrymen crawling onto the engine deck to shout through the pistol port. The beachhead was a narrow strip of sand and wreckage, in places only 20 yards deep. Bale and Ryan pulled everyone who could hold a rifle back to the seawall, expecting a banzai charge that never came. The Japanese had lost their commander, Admiral Shibasaki, killed by a naval shell in the afternoon, and their communications were shattered. All night, knee mortar rounds and sniper fire probed the perimeter, and nervous Marines knifed infiltrators in the dark. The tanks sat immobile, their crews sheltering in foxholes or under the hulls, waiting for the dawn. In the bruised pre-dawn stillness of 21 November, a pale grey light began to seep over the lagoon, revealing the full cost of the previous day's chaos. On Red Beach 1, where the seawall was still a twisted barricade of blasted coconut logs, a single M4A2 tank named Chinagal rumbled to life. Its commander, Lieutenant Bale, had spent the night shaking in a foxhole with a handful of infantry, listening to the Japanese drop mortar rounds among the dead, and now he climbed back into the turret. The tank he had taken over was the only fully functional armored vehicle on the entire western flank of the beachhead, a precarious asset about to be tested against a fortress of mutually supporting enemy bunkers. As Bale guided China Gal along the water's edge, the driver eased the 32-ton machine through the shallows to avoid crushing the wounded, who still lay packed below the seawall. At a cluster of coconut log emplacements known simply as the Pocket, Japanese machine gunners were still raking the reef, cutting down the boats of the reserve battalion struggling to reinforce Red Beach 2. Bale ordered the 75mm gun to fire point-blank into the rear entrance of a sand-covered position, the high explosive shell bursting inside with a muffled crump that lifted a cloud of dust through the firing ports. Before the debris had settled, a young Marine major named Mike Ryan was shouting for his infantry to rush forward with satchel charges and grenades. exactly the kind of ad hoc, close quarters, tank infantry teamwork that had never once been practiced in training. We designed, in about 60 seconds, the tank infantry tactics the Marine Corps would use the rest of World War II, Bale later recalled. Ryan's exhausted men had learned the hard way that a tank's cannon was the only weapon that could reliably silence a well-built Japanese emplacement. The 37mm guns of the division's light tanks had simply bounced off the sand and log walls, but the 75mm armor-piercing round from Chinagal could punch through coconut logs and detonate inside. Yet the ammunition problem that had plagued the company since the first hour of the landing was now acute. The LCMs carrying tank ammunition had been unable to cross the reef without being shredded by gunfire. What Bale's crew loaded into the breach that morning was not the standard 75mm tank round, but a shorter-cased pack howitzer shell, its rotating band misaligned so that it seated imperfectly in the chamber. The rounds had been scavenged from an artillery supply dump, brought ashore in 3-round bundles that the infantry called cloverleafs, and they worked barely, provided the fuse was set correctly, and the gunner did not hesitate to fire. Inside the turret, the loader and radio operator, a sergeant named Donald Pearson, heaved the heavy shells from the floor racks, his movements mechanical after hours of desperate loading the day before. Pearson, originally a gunner in another tank, had replaced the wounded tank commander of Conga earlier that morning, simply announcing, "The tank commander's just a figurehead anyway, let me take it." Now he fed round after round into the breach, his body bracing against the recoil as each discharge filled the turret with acrid propellant smoke. By 12:35 hours, Chinna, Gal, and Ryan's infantry had methodically worked their way down the narrow axis of Green Beach, destroying the defenses from the rear, a feat that the division commander would later call the most cheering news of D+1. With the beach secured, fresh troops of the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines began landing unopposed, wading ashore through surf that was no longer red with blood. On Red Beach 2, the situation was more desperate. The 2nd Platoon's command tank, Cobra, had spent the night on the exposed taxi strip behind the beach, its driver, Corporal Hester Webb, already dead from a sniper's bullet to the throat. At first light, the platoon leader received orders to attack the pocket from the water, a desperate attempt to suppress the interlocking machine gun fire that was bleeding the reserves. Sloat's tank rolled back into the lagoon, its tracks churning through the shallow coral, the gunner traversing the turret to fire at flashes half hidden behind the seawall. The water was deceptively smooth, masking deep shell craters and bomb holes that had swallowed 3 tanks the previous day. As Cobra maneuvered westward, its starboard track suddenly bit into empty water, the steel hull tilting with a sickening lurch, and within seconds the engine compartment was flooding, shorting out the voltage regulators and killing the diesel engines. The crew scrambled out through the top hatches, plunging into chest-deep water, and swam for the beach under a renewed hail of machine gun fire. Cobra, canted on its side in its water-filled grave, would remain there for decades, one of 2 tanks that could never be recovered from the island. The loss of Cobra, its crew swimming ashore under fire, left the center of the beachhead without tank support, a gap that the recovered Conga was hastily ordered to fill. The tank had been hauled out of its crater during the night, its engine deck still dented from the magnetic mine that had disabled Clipper's sister engine the previous afternoon. A cobbled-together crew now occupied its fighting compartment, with Pearson as acting tank commander and Charles Mason, a farm boy from Oregon, in the gunner's seat. Mason had just lost his own tank, Clipper, and he approached the replacement with the fatalistic pragmatism of a man who had already seen friends shot down in the surf. As Conga trundled toward the airfield, infantry from the remnants of the 1st and 2nd Battalions, 2nd Marines waved from their foxholes, their relief at the sight of the tank palpable. Mason traversed the periscope sight across the runway until he spotted a Japanese Type 41 mountain gun, its spoked wheels and tubular box trail silhouetted against the churned sand, and fired. The first 75mm shell struck the gun's carriage, flipping the weapon onto its back, and Mason later recalled, "It just happened to pick that doggone 75mm mountain gun up, flipped it up in the air, and set down right on the crew upside down. Killed every one of them." On Red Beach 3, the 3rd day's fighting revolved around a single tank, Colorado, now commanded by the indestructible Lieutenant Largy. Largy had lost his own vehicle in the massacre on the airfield, escaped the burning hulk of Cannonball on foot, and spent the night hunkered behind the seawall organizing the survivors of his shattered platoon. In the pre-dawn darkness, he had found the wounded Sergeant Mahn, who had been shot through the shoulder while standing outside his tank, and taken command of Colorado with the brusque authority of a Mustang officer who had once been a battleship sailor. Now Largy's voice crackled over the tank's unreliable intercom, directing a new crew that included driver Howard Rudloff, loader Bill Dunkel, and a recon guide named Hubert Krotz. A man so claustrophobic he could barely stand being inside the steel hull. Krotz volunteered to remain outside the tank, walking ahead of Colorado to spot targets and shift wounded Marines from its path. An act so dangerous that his Navy Cross citation later read simply, consistently exercising splendid initiative and expert technical skill. Krotz had developed his own method of communicating with the tank crew, taking a spent 75mm shell case and beating it against the armored hull until the men inside acknowledged they saw him. When he spotted a Japanese position, he would lay his rifle on the ground, pointing it at the target, and hold up his fingers to signal the range, a drill that had been taught at Pendleton, but that no one had ever believed would actually work under fire. Behind him, Colorado's gun fired, the muzzle blast sending a shockwave through the sand, and Krotz would flinch, then signal again. The method was crude, but it allowed Largy to systematically reduce the bunkers near the Burns-Philp Pier, including a steel pillbox that had defied all previous assaults. The engine compartment grew brutally hot, the twin GM diesels roaring under the strain of constant low-gear maneuvering, and inside the turret, Dunkel and Rudloff worked in a haze of diesel fumes and sweat, their utilities stiff with dried salt and blood. The ammunition shortage that plagued the entire beachhead was nowhere more acute than with Colorado. The supply of proper 75mm armor-piercing rounds had been exhausted early in the morning, and the crew had resorted to firing the same pack howitzer shells that Bale's tank was using, the shorter-cased rounds seating badly, but still delivering enough explosive force to crack coconut logs and silence machine guns. When those ran low, Largy dispatched Krotz and a few other men to scavenge from the disabled tanks that still littered the airfield, Conger, Cuddles, and the burned-out hulks of the 3rd Platoon's lost vehicles. The men dodged sniper fire to pry open ammunition racks, carrying the heavy shells back to the tank in their arms, their progress marked by the zing of rounds striking the coral around them. On one trip, Platoon Sergeant Charles Suter, who had landed with the infantry as a tank liaison and spent D-Day dodging death on the reef, commandeered a jeep and a trailer and somehow navigated through the enemy-held ground to deliver a load of ammunition to Colorado. For this and other actions, Suter would later receive a battlefield commission and a Silver Star, surviving the war to return home. By late morning, the Sherrod, a war correspondent who had come ashore on Red Beach 3, watched as Largy sauntered back to his tank after coordinating with the infantry. "Were you ever inside a tank when it gets hit?" Largy asked him conversationally. "The spot inside the tank where the shell hits turns a bright yellow, like a sunrise. My tank got 2 hits a while ago." The hits he referenced had gouged deep scars into Colorado's turret armor, but the thick steel had held. Largy's casual demeanor belied the fact that he had not slept in nearly 48 hours, that his platoon had been annihilated, and that his tank was running on fuel scavenged from other wrecks. He climbed back into the commander's hatch, and Colorado rumbled off toward yet another bunker, its elephant insignia still visible through the scorch marks on the hull side. South of the main runway, the advance of the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines was now spearheaded by Chinagal, with Bale maintaining a careful, deliberate pace. He had learned the previous day that moving too fast, without infantry support, was a recipe for destruction, and he kept the tank on the packed coral of the airstrip, where it could not bog down and where the infantry could keep pace. At one point, a swarm of Japanese soldiers burst from a hidden bunker and attempted to clamber onto the tank, one of them slapping a magnetic mine onto the sloped armor above the hull. The mine detonated, showering the interior with bolts and fragments, but the diesel fuel did not catch fire, and the engine continued to run. The assistant driver, a replacement named Clifford Quine, recalled the terrifying sight of the Japanese through his periscope, their bayonets and sabers hacking ineffectively at the steel. The tank pivoted, the bow machine gun fired, and the infantry closed in, and within minutes the attack was over, the bunker reduced to a smoking pile of sand and logs. As the afternoon wore on, the division's fortunes began to turn, a slow, grinding shift in momentum that was invisible to the men in the foxholes, but clear to the commanders studying their maps aboard the ships offshore. The central triangle of the airfield, which had been a no-man's land the previous day, was now firmly in Marine hands. The eastern end of the island, where the majority of the surviving Japanese defenders were concentrated, was being systematically compressed. The only counterstroke the Japanese could muster came at dusk, when a formation of twin-engine Betty bombers approached from the west, their engines droning over the shattered palm trees. The bombers dropped flares and a few desultory bombs that fell harmlessly among the Japanese-held positions, then turned away, chased by anti-aircraft fire from the destroyers in the lagoon. The much-feared Banzai counterattack, the human wave assault that the Marines had steeled themselves to repel, did not materialize. The Japanese commander, Admiral Shibasaki, was almost certainly dead, killed by a naval shell as he tried to shift his headquarters, and his decapitated garrison lacked the coordination to mount a coordinated charge. In the gathering darkness, Bale pulled Chinagal back to a position behind the front line, parking the tank among a cluster of foxholes where exhausted infantry were already digging in for the night. He dismounted from the turret, his throat raw from shouting, his uniform stiff with grime, and found a patch of sand beneath the tank's hull. Around him, the sounds of the front line were constant: sporadic rifle fire, the crump of mortars, the distant roar of naval guns. The tank's crew slept in shifts, one man always at the controls, ready to respond if the Japanese infiltrators who filtered through the lines attempted to swarm the vehicle. On Red Beach 3, Colorado also pulled back, parking in the shallow water at the base of the main pier, where its machine guns could sweep the shore. Largy and Krotz huddled beside the track, sharing a canteen of tepid water, their conversation brief and functional. The reserves were ashore now, the beachhead was expanding, and the tide of the battle, like the tide in the lagoon, had finally turned. As dawn broke on 22 November, the third day of fighting, a grinding metallic column formed on the scarred southern edge of Betio's main runway. Company Commander Bale, now in the repaired tank Chinagal, pulled alongside the fresh infantry of Lieutenant Colonel William Jones's 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, their boots crunching on pulverized coral. The objective was a sweep eastward, a methodical march to crush the Japanese defenders trapped on the narrowing tail of the island. Bale did not advance alone for long. From the assembly area near the beach rumbled a flock of light tanks from C Company of the 2nd Tank Battalion, their 37mm guns and multiple machine guns chattering as they fell into formation. Standing in the turret of his command tank, Bale instructed the light tank commanders to hold back, using Chinagal's thicker armor and heavier cannon as a shield. The ad hoc formation, a mother hen trailed by armored chicks, set a steady pace, its commanders knowing that each mound of churned sand ahead could conceal a reinforced bunker. Progress was a brutal, repetitive rhythm of point-blank fire. An infantryman, crawling through the debris, would tap on the back of Chinagal's turret and yell a target bearing through the open pistol port. The tank's 75mm gun would blast a coconut log emplacement at a range of 20 yards, the shell detonating inside with a muffled thump before the riflemen rushed forward to finish the position with grenades. The gunner in Chinagal found the work grimly efficient, scanning for the next dark aperture through his periscope as the tank shuddered with each recoil, the 75mm cannon hammering another emplacement into silence. Securing the north side of the runway, the sole operational medium tank on that flank, Colorado, was continuing its own war of physical attrition. Lieutenant Largy, commanding Colorado, navigated the tank through the broken earthworks near the airfield's turning circle. The driver, Private First Class Howard Rudloff, wrestling the levers to avoid deep shell craters. Walking ahead, the recon guide Corporal Hubert Krotz signaled targets using his rifle laid flat on the ground and banged on the hull with a spent shell casing to direct Largy's fire, a hazardous, intimate dance of steel and flesh. Amid the wreckage, Charles Mason noticed the body of a Japanese officer, his uniform half buried in the sand, a small, peculiar medal pinned to his chest, an artifact from a forgotten military order that Mason, a former farm boy from Oregon, paused to retrieve before climbing back to his gunner's seat. Largy's gunner traversed the turret and fired a canister round point blank into a coconut log emplacement, the thin metal shell disintegrating to release a lethal swarm of steel balls that shredded the interior. A handful of stunned defenders stumbled from the shattered bunker directly into the tank's machine gun sights. A second, smaller rush of men met the same fate from the combined machine gun fire of the tanks and infantry, the bodies piling up in a brutal static barrier before the bunker's entrance. As the advance ground on, the critical shortage of ammunition forced both tanks to consume whatever rounds could be scavenged. Cloverleaf bundles of 75mm pack howitzer shells, brought ashore for infantry support guns, were broken open and loaded into the tank's breeches. The shorter casings seating with an imperfect metallic scrape. The rounds flew with a different trajectory, but still detonated with enough force to crack coconut logs, their use a testament to the broken logistics that had plagued the landing from the first moments on the reef. By mid-afternoon, the coordinated push had sheared through the center of the trapped Japanese garrison. China Gal and Colorado advanced along their respective sides of the runway, the light tanks spraying fire into battered revetments, isolating the defenders into a shrinking pocket on the eastern sandspit. The tactical isolation was complete, but the infantry commanders halted the advance early, ordering the tanks to pull back a short distance and form a laager for the night behind the main line of foxholes. The men in the foxholes knew the pattern of Japanese desperation. A counterattack was a near certainty, and Bale, positioning Chinagel behind the front lines, prepared for the final fanatical charge that had not materialized on the previous 2 nights. As the tropical dusk fell rapidly, the only sounds were the sporadic crack of a sniper's rifle and the distant rhythmic crump of naval shells probing the far tip of Betio. At 19:30 hours, the darkness erupted. A hail of machine gun fire lashed the lines of the 1st Battalion's 6th Marines, followed by a screaming wave of nearly 300 Japanese soldiers determined to break through. The supporting tanks, engines already idling, did not need radios to understand the crisis. Their commanders saw the green tracers streaking through the night and opened fire with every weapon, the cannons blasting canister and high-explosive rounds into the onrushing silhouettes. The infantry, Marines exhausted but dug in, met the charge with rifles, bayonets, and knives as naval star shells turned the battlefield into a stark, monochromatic hell. The struggle continued for hours, a fragmented, close-quarters slaughter fought under flickering artificial moonlight. By dawn, the attack had spent itself completely. Hundreds of dead enemy soldiers lay twisted in the sand, and the American line, anchored by the relentless fire of China Gal and Colorado, had held. Observing the carnage from his command post, Colonel Merritt A. Edson noted with grim professional respect that the Japanese, in their desperation, had given the Marines very able assistance by trying to counterattack, a final, suicidal effort that broke the back of organized resistance. The morning light on 23 November revealed the full scale of the destruction on the eastern tail, a moonscape of craters littered with broken bodies and the shattered remnants of the Japanese garrison. In the final advance, the 2 medium tanks formed a line abreast with the light tanks and rolled forward, encountering only isolated, dazed survivors who were gunned down or crushed as the Marines reached the far shore. The island was declared secure, and for the survivors, the sudden silence, after 76 hours of continuous deafening violence, was a physical, almost painful presence. At 8 in the morning on November 23rd, the 2 surviving medium tanks formed a line abreast with the remaining light tanks and rolled forward onto the eastern tail of Betio. The ground ahead was a moonscape of overlapping craters, blasted palm stumps, and the shattered remnants of Japanese defensive works. First Lieutenant Edward Bale, commanding Chinagel, surveyed the terrain through his periscope as the formation crossed the captured anti-tank ditch and pushed into the final pocket of resistance. Second Lieutenant Louis Largy, in Colorado, kept his tank slightly offset to starboard, his driver Howard Rudloff easing the 32-ton vehicle around a deep crater filled with twisted, smoldering wreckage. The remaining Japanese defenders were isolated, cut off from command and supply, but still lethal. From scattered bunkers and foxholes, rifle fire clattered against the tank's hulls, the bullets pinging off the armor like hailstones. Bale methodically worked each position, directing his gunner Charles Mason to fire high-explosive rounds into firing ports at distances of less than 30 yards. The concussion of each 75mm blast shuddered through the tank's frame, and the acrid smell of burnt propellant seeped into the turret, stinging the crew's eyes and throats. On the north side of the runway, Colorado moved past a large, half-collapsed bunker when a sudden screaming wave of Japanese soldiers burst from its dark interior. They charged with fixed bayonets and magnetic mines held above their heads, their faces contorted in a frenzy of desperation. Largy did not hesitate. He ordered his gunner to traverse the turret and fire a high-explosive round directly into the heart of the charging mass. The 75mm shell detonated at point-blank range, the blast and shrapnel tearing through the tightly packed group and killing an estimated 50 to 75 men in a single devastating instant. That single shot shattered the backbone of organized resistance on the eastern tip. By early afternoon, the surviving Japanese were reduced to a handful of dazed individuals crawling from flooded foxholes. Their weapons rusted and their bodies emaciated from 4 days without food or water. The Marines of the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, moved forward behind the tanks, methodically clearing each position with grenades and small arms. At 13:10 hours, the 1st Infantrymen reached the shallow water at the extreme eastern point of the island. Betio was declared secure. Across the island, the sudden silence after 76 hours of continuous deafening violence was a physical shock. Men who had been screaming commands over the roar of cannon fire now found themselves whispering in the oppressive stillness, their ears still ringing from the sustained noise of battle. The air, thick with the stench of decomposing bodies, diesel fumes, and burnt explosives, hung heavy and motionless under the brutal equatorial sun. The island was a charnel house, littered with twisted metal, shattered coconut logs, and the bloated bodies of the dead. At 1 o'clock, a flag-raising ceremony was hastily organized near the captured Japanese command bunker. The Marines scoured the island for the necessary items, eventually rigging 2 stripped palm trunks as makeshift flagpoles. The company bugler, Private First Class Jimmy Williams, stepped forward with a battered, dented bugle he had carried through the campaign, standing rigidly at attention in a set of clean dungarees that had been brought ashore that morning. He raised the instrument to his lips and played "To the Colours" as the American flag, followed by a small British Union Jack, was raised over the ruined island. The notes, thin and slightly wavering in the hot, still air, marked the formal change of ownership and the end of the battle for Betio. On the following day, the grim work of burying the dead began. Charlie Company had suffered severely, 8 men confirmed killed in action, 5 more known to be dead, but their graves later lost, and now listed as missing, and 30 wounded badly enough to require evacuation. Many of the wounded, like Sergeant John Mahon, shot through the shoulder on the first night, and Private Joe Woolham, the shattered end of his right forefinger shot away, had already been ferried out to hospital ships lying offshore. Chaplains, assistants, and volunteers moved across the island, cutting identity tags from bodies, recording wounds, and dragging the dead into shallow, hastily scraped graves in the soft coral sand. While the infantry policed the battlefield, Warrant Officer Roger Massey and his maintenance section began the laborious process of salvaging the company's wrecked and disabled tanks. Massey, a former motor transport sergeant and a Texan who had dropped out of high school to enlist during the Depression, was, in Bale's words, a genius at keeping things running. Working without the M32B2 recovery vehicle that had been left behind in New Caledonia for lack of shipping space, Massey improvised a system using the towing cables stripped from functional tanks, rigging 2 or 3 vehicles on the shore to drag the drowned machines from the lagoon and shell craters. Voltage regulators that had been submerged in seawater were carefully dried out, disassembled, and rebuilt. In the end, Massey and his crews managed to recover all but 2 of the 14 tanks. The burned and mangled Cannonball, its starboard sponson armor peeled back like rubber by the ammunition fire that consumed it, was a total loss. Cobra, which had sunk in a deep crater off the boundary between Red 1 and Red 2, was canted sideways and broadside to the beach, its mass too great for anything on the island to budge. Those 2 vehicles would remain on Betio, slowly rusting in the tropical salt air, Cobra still visible today, embedded in the coral in its final watery grave. On November 27th, the surviving members of Charlie Company re-embarked aboard the USS Ashland with 6 recovered medium tanks. The big landing ship got underway almost immediately, steaming for Hawaii at the best speed its civilian crew could manage. During the long Pacific transit, the men sat on the steel decks, cleaning salt from their salvaged weapons, writing letters home, and staring at the empty spaces where their friends should have been sitting. The tank turret in which they had lived, fought, and watched their comrades die seemed in memory simultaneously a steel tomb and the only reason they were still breathing. The Ashland arrived at Hilo, Hawaii on December 9th. After midnight, the men were offloaded and packed into a convoy of trucks for a 60-mile drive around the island and up the slopes of the Mauna Loa volcano. They arrived at the Parker Ranch, a vast cattle operation situated in a topographic saddle between 2 dormant volcanoes, at a site that would become known as Camp Tarawa. There was nothing there but rolling grass and a cold, persistent wind that reminded the men of Oklahoma. They lived in squad tents for most of the next 6 months, enduring the daily extremes of volcanic weather, their training temporarily replaced by the administrative necessities of reconstituting a shattered unit. The lessons of Tarawa were absorbed with a grim intensity by the Marine Corps High Command. The obsolete GF-RU aircraft radios, which had failed so catastrophically under the stress of combat and saltwater immersion, were replaced with new Army Signal Corps SCR 508 and SCR 528 frequency-modulated sets, sound-powered EE-1 telephones, jury-rigged to the rear of new Georgia light tanks the previous summer, were now formally installed on the exterior of every medium tank, connected to the internal intercom so that infantry could speak directly to the crew. One tank in each company was fitted with a bulldozer blade, a direct response to the grim discovery that destroyed bunkers were often reoccupied by Japanese filtering through hidden tunnel networks. The M3 light tanks, their 37mm guns proven incapable of destroying hardened coconut log and sand emplacements, were relegated to secondary roles or converted to flamethrower vehicles. The future of Marine Corps armor lay exclusively with the diesel-powered M4A2 medium tank. On February 15, 1944, the 1st Corps Medium Tank Battalion was formally disbanded, its companies were absorbed into the divisional tank battalions, and Charlie Company became Able Company, 2nd Tank Battalion, assigned permanently to the 2nd Marine Division. The men who had survived the horror of Betio began training for their next objective, an island in the Marianas called Saipan, with a new sense of grim professionalism. Bale, now promoted to captain, drove his crews relentlessly through combined arms exercises, forcing his tank commanders and the infantry officers to walk through every phase of the planned assault on a chalk-lined mock-up of the landing beach. On June 15, 1944, the company landed on Saipan. Second Lieutenant Richard Sloat, the former high school speech and drama teacher, whose red hair had earned him the nickname Red Dog Fox, had been the company's first commanding officer at Pendleton and was now the supply officer, shuttling ammunition and supplies from the beach to the tanks. On one afternoon, he encountered a platoon of tanks from C Company, 4th Tank Battalion, halted at the edge of an open area they believed might be a minefield. Bale, knowing the road had been traveled hours earlier and was clear, was about to relay the information, but Sloat insisted on going himself. He moved carefully toward the lead tank, intending to use the new external telephone to communicate with the crew. But when the phone failed, he decided to climb onto the tank and speak directly to the commander. A Japanese sniper, hidden in the dense vegetation, shot him through the head. The company had lost the officer Bale, considered the best lieutenant he had ever served with. Corporal Hubert Crotts, the reconnaissance guide who had directed Colorado's fire on Betio by banging a spent shell casing against the turret, had his phenomenal luck run out in the same campaign. While signaling targets across a muddy field near Lake Susupe, a burst of machine gun fire tore through both his legs. He was evacuated through a chain of aid stations, each stop a fresh agony as he was lifted on and off bouncing Jeep ambulances, until he finally reached a ship and began the long journey back to the United States. His war over Sergeant Michael Shivitz, who had survived the flashback inside Setilia when a Japanese shell struck the muzzle of the gun, continued to serve in the company. In the quiet moments between battles, he reflected on that moment when the turret lit up like a Christmas tree and shrapnel peppered his body. A wound too minor to report, but one that reminded him daily of how close he had come to being vaporized had there been a shell in the breach. Long after the war, he would describe the journey of the company not as a military campaign, but as a slow, grinding evolution from terrified boys into hardened men. Transformation forged in the coral dust and blood of that tiny, God-forsaken island. The company went on to fight at Tinian, and then, in the late spring of 1945, supported army troops in the brief but violent struggle for Aishima, a small island off the coast of Okinawa. In the final phase of the last great battle of the Pacific War, the 8th Marines, with Bale's tanks in support, were committed to the southern tip of Okinawa to help break the final Japanese defensive line. By then, the crews were old hands, veterans who had seen their friends killed in every conceivable way, and who approached each new landing with the fatalistic professionalism of men who had accepted that their survival was purely a matter of chance. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the rumor swept through the ranks that they would be going home immediately. Instead, the company was loaded onto LSTs for occupation duty in Nagasaki, a city that had been erased from the earth by a single bomb. They stood on the beach at Okinawa, watching the flat-bottomed landing ships lower their ramps, and the old salts among them, men who had crossed the equator, survived the reef at Betio, and watched their friends die on a half-dozen islands, knew exactly where they were going. In the decades after the war, the survivors of Charlie Company dispersed back into the vastness of American civilian life. Woolham, the young Oklahoman who had grabbed onto Colorado's lifting ring and been knocked back into the sand as shells burst around him, eventually moved back to Oklahoma and worked as a journeyman painter. He carried the physical reminder of Tarawa with him always, the dead bone at the end of his right forefinger, the soft tissue that had never fully grown back. Late in life, he would look back across the decades and say simply, "I should have died when I was 19 years old. I should have never got off Tarawa. It's been borrowed time since then." Marn, the sergeant who gave up his tank to Laji and walked wounded through neck-deep water with his injured gunner, returned to Montana and became a ranch manager. The memories of the screaming artillery, the smell of burning diesel, and the sight of Marines dropping into the surf around him never fully left him. But he, like many, learned to pack them away into a locked compartment of his mind, accessible only in rare moments of quiet reflection. Bale remained in the Marine Corps for 30 years, 1 month and 16 days, serving as a battalion commander in Korea and as a division chief of staff in Vietnam. In 1993, he returned to Betio for the 50th anniversary of the battle. He found an island so densely populated that it was one of the most crowded places on Earth, its lagoon contaminated by raw sewage, its beaches littered with trash, and its people malnourished and unemployed. The physical monument to the battle, the sunken tanks, the rusting naval guns, the crumbling bunkers, was being slowly swallowed by the encroaching shanty town, the sacrifices of his men buried under a layer of squalor that no ceremony could erase. Yet the true monument to Charlie Company and the men who fought on Tarawa is not a physical one. It exists in the hard-won institutional knowledge that transformed a green, poorly equipped medium tank company into the nucleus of a new amphibious warfare doctrine. The tank infantry tactics improvised by a young first lieutenant and a major on the bullet-swept sands of Red One became the standard operating procedure for every Marine Corps tank battalion for the remainder of the war and beyond. The radios, the external telephones, the bulldozer blades, and the doctrinal shifts that emerged from the after-action reports of that brutal 76-hour struggle saved countless lives in the campaigns that followed, on Saipan, on Tinian, on Iwo Jima, and on Okinawa. In time, the coral atoll of Betio will experience the fate of all such islands. It will slowly sink beneath the waves, eroded by the relentless Pacific, to become one more silent seamount in an ocean whose very name, Pacific, is a lie against the violence it has witnessed. But the image of a 19-year-old Marine, standing in neck-deep water with machine gun bullets churning the surface around him, waving a 30-ton tank toward an unseen beach, will remain as the enduring human legacy of that battle. It is a legacy not of flags or monuments, but of endurance, of the simple refusal to quit in the face of incomprehensible horror, purchased at a terrible price by a generation now almost entirely gone from us.